Imagine walking alone through the dark, rotting docks of Port Royal, the air thick with salt, rum and regrets too heavy to speak aloud. From the fog, a broken man appears. Samuel Ortega, once a proud sailor of the Spanish Navy, now reduced to nothing but trembling hands and unfinished confessions. But tonight, he carries something more than guilt, a secret. About the San Lorenzo, a Spanish galleon set to sail at dawn, loaded with gold, gunpowder, and enough weapons to shift the balance of power. In the Caribbean, and hidden among the shadows, listening from the balcony of the Lost Souls Tavern, is Blackbeard himself. Not a myth, not a ghost, but a living threat, deciding whether Ortega's words are worth hearing or silencing forever. What drives a man to betray his country, risking everything just to save a brother locked away in a distant prison cell in Cartagena? This isn't just another pirate story. This is a confession, heavy with guilt, betrayal, and the kind of desperation only the sea understands. Welcome to the channel, The Pirate's Diary. If tales of pirates, lost oaths, and cursed gold stir something in you, the sea keeps its stories, but only for those who dare to remember. Will you join the crew? Subscribe and step aboard. The fog rolled in thick and slow, swallowing the horizon long before the first light of dawn could break through. On the deck of the Queen Anne's Revenge, the wood creaked beneath restless boots. The sea was still, almost holding its breath, as if it too feared what Blackbeard was about to unleash. His men gathered around him in a tight, uneasy circle. Elias McCrow, the gunner with hands burned from too many cannons, fired in anger. Jonas Ward, the boatswain whose voice once roared commands but now stayed quiet, as if words might betray what little hope he had left. And Isla Devereux, the sharp-eyed woman with a talent for explosives and a silence that made even seasoned men nervous. Together, they stood as witnesses to whatever Blackbeard had been plotting in the darkest corners of his mind. They had all heard whispers about the San Lorenzo, a Spanish galleon, heavy with gold, weapons and supplies, sailing straight through the narrowest part of the Caribbean, a stretch of water sailors called the Strait of Souls. Two jagged cliffs rose on either side, leaving barely enough room for a single ship to pass. One wrong move, one snap of wind, and a vessel could shatter against the rocks like glass. But it wasn't the danger of the cliffs that haunted Blackbeard tonight. It was something else, a question that had been eating at him for months, long before Ortega's trembling confession reached his ears. How far was he willing to go to make his name something men feared long after their bones turned to dust? His eyes, dark and unblinking, scanned his crew. He didn't need to shout. His voice, low and steady, carried through the fog like a promise and a warning. "We strike at dawn," he said, his tone cold enough to still the sea itself. "When the San Lorenzo enters the strait, we close in from both sides. No escape, no mercy." Elias shifted, his fingers twitching near the powder kegs. Jonas swallowed hard but nodded once. "And Isla?" She smiled, just slightly, before vanishing below deck to prepare the charges that would turn water and air into fire. But as the crew dispersed to ready themselves for the ambush, Blackbeard remained at the helm, staring out into the endless grey, lost in a war only he could see. There were voices in that fog, real or imagined. He no longer cared. They spoke of old friends left behind, of brothers who never returned, of choices that could never be undone. He remembered every face, every scream, every ship that sank because he gave the order, and still, the question remained, was this just another raid? Or would tomorrow become the day history began to speak his name with fear, long after the sea had claimed them all? The mist thickened, the strait waited, and somewhere, in the distance, the San Lorenzo sailed forward, unaware of the storm about to descend. The night swallowed the Queen Anne's Revenge as she drifted through the fog, moving like a shadow too heavy to be seen, but too close to ignore. No lanterns burned, no voices rose above whispers. Every creak of the hull sounded like a warning from the sea itself. But no one dared stop. High above the waterline, Isla Devereux led two of the crew, silent men with sunken eyes and steady hands, up the jagged cliffs of Las Animas. Each of them carried barrels of powder strapped to their backs, their steps careful but hurried. The path was treacherous, loose stones threatening to betray them with every shift. Samuel Ortega climbed with them, under the watchful eye of Jonas Ward, whose blade never left its sheath, but stayed close enough to remind Ortega what was at stake. The former Spanish sailor trembled with every breath, his face pale, drenched in sweat, not from the climb, but from fear. His heart knew that any wrong move, whether on these rocks or in this plan, would mean the end of him. Below, on the deck of the Revenge, Blackbeard bent over a cracked piece of parchment, his fingers tracing slow, deliberate lines, again and again, as if each stroke was a curse he meant to carve into the sea, the angle of the morning wind, the pull of the current, the likely positioning of the Spanish gunners aboard the San Lorenzo. He mapped it all, not out of caution, but out of obsession. This wasn't just about stopping the galleon. No, Blackbeard wanted it crippled, stranded between the cliffs like a wooden skeleton for all the Caribbean to see. A monument to fear, a warning carved in wreckage and smoke. He could already picture it. The San Lorenzo lodged against the rocks, its sails torn, its cannons useless, her treasure spilling like blood into the sea. But in the pit of his mind, deeper than strategy, darker than revenge, there lingered a voice, quiet, cold, and familiar. "How far will you go?" Blackbeard didn't answer it, not yet. His crew followed orders. The powder was being set, the trap was tightening, and somewhere behind the fog, the Spanish galleon continued forward, blind, trusting the safety of waters that would soon betray them. The first pale light of dawn struggled to cut through the thick curtain of fog. The sea remained a dull sheet of grey, motionless and heavy, as if holding its breath for the violence it knew was coming. Blackbeard stood alone at the bow of the Queen Anne's Revenge, staring at the northern cliffs of Las Animas. His eyes, dark, tired, and sharp as broken glass, searched for anything that felt wrong, anything that smelled like betrayal. And that's when he saw it, not with his own eyes, but through the trembling voice of the lookout stationed on the mainmast. "Captain, lights on the north ridge, 3 flashes, like mirror signals." The words froze the air around them. The lookout's voice was careful, almost apologetic, as if he already knew that delivering bad news to Blackbeard was like lighting a fuse with wet fingers. Sooner or later, it would burn through. Blackbeard turned slowly, his face unreadable. 3 flashes, a known code, a military signal, a language no man aboard his ship should even understand, let alone use. His jaw tightened. The crew continued their preparations, unaware of the storm brewing inside their captain. Below deck, Isla was setting the final lengths of fuse. Elias was double-checking the powder charges. Jonas stood near the quarterdeck, sharpening a blade that already knew too much of other men's mistakes. And Ortega. Blackbeard's gaze drifted toward the cliffs. The Spaniard had climbed those rocks with Isla's team just hours earlier. Ortega had sworn loyalty, sworn that he wanted nothing but to save his brother, sworn that he'd trade every coin in Spain to buy back a single moment of dignity. But Blackbeard knew men like Ortega. He'd seen that look too many times, the look of a man torn between survival and damnation, the look of someone already halfway to betrayal. Standing motionless at the helm, Blackbeard felt the weight of 1,000 memories pressing against his ribs, faces of sailors who had once called him brother and later betrayed him for promises of gold or a pardon from some distant crown. And always, it ended the same way. with silence, with blood in the water, with names that disappeared like smoke in the wind. He breathed deep, letting the salt air fill his lungs, pushing down the rage that clawed at his throat. This wasn't the time for rage, not yet. Turning toward Jonas, he spoke low and steady. "Double the watch, and if you see Ortega again, bring him to me." Quietly. Jonas gave a short nod and disappeared into the fog like a ghost. The minutes dragged on. Somewhere beyond the curtain of mist, the San Lorenzo was moving, its sails full, its crew blissfully unaware of the trap waiting ahead. Blackbeard's heart beat slower now, colder. The plan had reached a point of no return. Powder was set, cannons were ready, the cliff charges waited for a single spark. But in the back of his mind, a voice refused to quiet. There's another traitor here, or maybe the same one, lying twice in the same life. The fog began to thin, revealing the dark silhouette of the Spanish galleon cutting through the strait, beautiful, proud, and already sailing toward her own ruin. Blackbeard narrowed his eyes. There would be no turning back. Not for the San Lorenzo, and not for the man who had dared signal from the cliffs. The first bell rang aboard the San Lorenzo, its sound slicing through the morning fog like the toll of an unseen church bell far from shore. For the Spanish sailors, it was just the start of another day. For Blackbeard, it was the signal he had been waiting for. Standing at the edge of the deck, his arm lifted, slow, deliberate, like the executioner giving the final nod. Hidden among the rocks high above, Ila Devereux watched. For that exact gesture, her hands moved fast but steady, striking flint to steel until the fuse caught. The spark hissed to life, racing along the hand-braided line of powder that snaked across the cliff's edge. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Then, the world shattered. The explosion tore through the northern ridge with a force that made the sea itself recoil. Stones the size of ship hulls broke loose, tumbling into the strait below. Water erupted skyward, mixed with wood. Splinters and shouts of panic from the San Lorenzo. The Spanish galleon didn't stand a chance. Her rudder snapped like brittle bone. The forward cannons, once her pride, were ripped from their moorings and disappeared beneath the waves. Men on deck screamed for orders, but none came fast enough. The ship lurched violently, its hull scraping against jagged rock until it wedged itself at a brutal angle between the cliffs, like a wounded animal struggling for air. Blackbeard never flinched. Before the dust settled, before the Spaniards could even understand what had hit them, the Queen Anne's Revenge emerged from the fog, silent, dark, and terrifying. Her black sails cut through the mist like wings of death, her figurehead looming with a grin carved by time and salt. "Fire!" Blackbeard whispered, and hell answered. The cannons roared from the lower deck, their thunder shaking the air. Cannonballs ripped through the already broken stern of the San Lorenzo, splintering masts and tearing sails apart like paper. From above, Jonas Ward shouted orders with the sharp authority of a man who had seen too many battles and survived them all. The boarding crews lined the rails, swords drawn, grappling hooks ready. Their boots pounded the planks like war drums as they rushed to meet their prey. Elias McCrow, standing at the main battery, loaded and fired with a rage that burned deeper than any powder charge. With every blast, it felt as if he was trying to break more than just wood and iron, as if he wanted to crack the sky itself. The air filled with screams, gunfire, and the sickening crunch of wood meeting steel. The sea turned violent, waves thrashing against both ships as if the water itself had been pulled into the fight. And through it all, Blackbeard remained at the helm, watching, calculating, unmoved by the chaos he had orchestrated. His crew didn't fight for gold alone. They fought for him, for the fear his name cast over the sea, for the legend they were now part of, whether they wanted it or not. Below the noise, buried beneath the crack of gunfire and the splintering of masts, the captain's mind stayed cold and focused. There would be time for questions later. For now, the trap had been sprung, and the San Lorenzo was exactly where he wanted her, broken, helpless, and his. The deck of the San Lorenzo had become a scene of chaos. Splintered wood, torn sails, and scattered barrels rolled aimlessly as Blackbeard's men stormed through what remained of the Spanish galleon. The air was thick with smoke and salt, the cries of surrender mixing with the clash of steel and the sharp crack of musket fire. But in the middle of all this, something far worse was unfolding. Samuel Ortega, the broken sailor who had begged for redemption, was gone. Blackbeard noticed the absence too late. While Jonas led the boarders and Elias oversaw the powder scavenging, Ortega had slipped away, quiet as a shadow, unnoticed in the confusion. When Jonas finally reported the missing prisoner, Blackbeard's stomach tightened, not with fear, but with that cold, familiar recognition, the kind that only comes when you realize a mistake too late. Blackbeard's boots pounded across the ruined deck, his coat trailing behind him like a black flame. He moved with the speed of a man chasing more than just a runaway. He was chasing control, chasing the truth he hadn't wanted to face. The first clue came as a faint column of smoke rising from the northern promontory, a thin grey signal curling into the morning sky. A signal Blackbeard recognized instantly, a prearranged code. Old, simple, but deadly effective. A warning meant for distant eyes, for Spanish warships lying just beyond the horizon. Somewhere near the cliff edge, Blackbeard found the remnants of the setup, a rudimentary transmitter, little more than oil-soaked cloth and a few dry branches hidden beneath loose stones. The fire was fresh. The flames still hissed. Ortega had known exactly what he was doing. Blackbeard stood over the dying fire, his hands clenched tight enough to draw blood from his palms. Rage burned deep, but it was too late for rage now. He turned toward the open sea, and there, where the fog had started to lift, the horizon betrayed him. 2 Spanish frigates, full sail, moving fast, their hulls dark and low, their decks crowded with soldiers, cannons already loaded and trained toward the narrow throat of Las Animas. The ambush that Blackbeard had so carefully crafted had been turned against him, a trap inside the trap. He didn't speak, not at first. His eyes stayed locked on the enemy ships, watching their sails swell with wind, their bows cutting through the water like knives meant for him. Behind him, Jonas and Elias appeared, out of breath and still stained with the powder of battle. Jonas spoke first, his voice rough. "Orders, Captain." For a moment, Blackbeard said nothing, letting the silence stretch long enough for both men to feel the weight of what was incoming. Then, in a voice low and steady, the same voice that had pulled them through storm after storm, he answered, "We turn the Revenge to face them, load every cannon, and pray the sea still remembers who we are." The crew scrambled into position, fear and adrenaline driving their steps. Grappling hooks were reeled back, powder kegs were stacked near the guns. Isla rushed from below deck with a bundle of emergency charges clutched to her chest. Blackbeard remained at the helm, eyes unblinking, heart steady. Betrayal had found its way aboard, again, but this time, he would not be the one left broken in the water. The sea turned violent, as if the ocean itself had caught the scent of blood and fear. The 2 Spanish frigates closed in fast, sails full, cannons already glowing at the mouths. Their flags flew high, their decks lined with soldiers eager to finish what Ortega had started. Blackbeard's crew, scattered between the crippled San Lorenzo and the Queen Anne's, Revenge scrambled to form any kind of defense. There was no time for strategy, no room for hesitation. Blackbeard stood high on the mainmast, wind tearing at his coat, his voice raw as he shouted orders that barely carried over the rising noise. "Bring the powder barrels forward, block their approach, use their own death against them." Men ran with trembling hands, rolling the Spanish powder kegs toward the edge of the wreck. Jonas Ward, blood pouring from a fresh wound in his shoulder, fought through the pain, dragging 2 barrels across the broken deck with gritted teeth. Every movement left a trail of red behind him, but he didn't stop. Not for pain, not for fear, not for anything. Below, Isla Devereux worked with a grim focus. Her face and clothes were streaked with black powder, her hands moving with a speed that only desperation could bring. She packed the last of the charges beneath the lower hold of the San Lorenzo, wiring them tight, her mind already counting the seconds they didn't have. Elias McCrow stood at the gun line, firing at anything that moved on the horizon. His eyes wild, his voice hoarse from shouting to reload faster, to aim lower, to fire sooner. Smoke filled the air until he could barely see what he was aiming at, but still he fired. And at the center of it all, Blackbeard remained, a dark silhouette screaming through the chaos, half voice, half storm. "Hold the line! Make them pay for every inch they take!" The Spanish frigates opened fire. Cannonballs tore through the water, throwing waves high against both ships. Splinters of wood exploded from the deck. Men were thrown back, some screaming, some silent, some already too broken to rise again. Jonas fell to one knee, clutching his shoulder, his breath shallow but still cursing through the pain. Isla crawled up from the cargo hold, her eyes burning from the smoke, shouting over the roar, "Charges are set! We light them when you say." But Blackbeard knew the truth. They couldn't hold this position much longer. The Revenge was taking damage by the minute, her sails already torn, her starboard cannons nearly silent. The San Lorenzo, once their prize, was now a prison, a coffin filled with powder and broken men. Every decision now was a blade with no handle. No matter which way he turned, someone was going to bleed. The Spanish ships kept coming. Their soldiers readied boarding hooks. Their cannons roared again. The sea boiled between them, turning red in places where men had fallen overboard and hadn't come back up. Blackbeard's voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the weight of holding back collapse. "Prepare the final charge," he roared, looking at Isla, then at Elias, then at the battered faces of every man who still stood. There would be no retreat, not today. This was no longer about gold or revenge or even survival. It was about legacy, about making the sea remember them, even if it had to remember them in pieces. The deck of the Queen Anne's Revenge was no longer a battlefield. It had become something worse, a place where men stood shoulder to shoulder, already knowing how the story might end. Smoke hung low over the ship, curling between broken masts and splintered rails. The smell of gunpowder, salt, and fear clung to every breath. The sea around them churned, blackened by oil and streaked with debris. In the distance, the Spanish frigates circled like wolves, ready for the final strike. Blackbeard stood in the center of the deck, his face pale under layers of soot and sweat. His coat hung in tatters, his voice rough from shouting over cannon fire for what felt like hours. Yet even now, his eyes stayed sharp, focused. He called for Jonas, whose shoulder was hastily bandaged, but whose spirit remained unbroken. Isla stood close, her skin still dusted with powder, her eyes blazing with something halfway between fear and defiance. Elias wiped blood from his brow, reloading with trembling hands. Blackbeard gathered them close. "We have 2 paths," he said, his voice low, each word like iron dragged across stone. "We can take what little we've stolen, run for open water, hope the sea favors us long enough to disappear." He paused, letting the weight of that hope sink in. "Or His gaze shifted toward the burning silhouette of the San Lorenzo, still wedged against the rocks, still packed with enough powder to light the sky. Or we stay. Fight until the last man stands, and turn this strait into a graveyard no captain will dare cross again. The silence that followed wasn't fear. It was calculation. Each officer measured their strength, their wounds, their loyalty. Jonas clenched his jaw. Isla crossed her arms over her chest, nodding without a word. Elias let out a bitter laugh, spitting over the side as if mocking death itself. But before giving the final order, Blackbeard did something none of them expected. Without explanation, he descended alone into the shattered hold of the San Lorenzo. The lower decks smelled of wet wood and rot, with shadows stretching long and cold. The air grew thinner with every step, beneath the cargo levels, deep in the makeshift brig. Samuel Ortega sat against the far wall, knees pulled to his chest, a rusted knife trembling in his hands. His face, the face of a man who had tried to be brave but had drowned in his own fear, was streaked with tears and dirt. The knife point pressed against his skin, but he hadn't found the courage to finish what he started. When Blackbeard entered, Ortega froze. The captain said nothing at first, just stared at him, at the wreckage of a man who had started this nightmare. Ortega opened his mouth, but no words came, only choked gasps, sobs. The sound of a man too broken to ask for forgiveness, but too scared to disappear. Blackbeard stepped closer, crouched until his eyes met Ortega's. And then, with a voice raw and cracked from smoke and shouting, but still steady enough to cut bone, he said, "You chose this ending." The words hung there, heavy, final. Blackbeard stood, turned without waiting for a reply, and walked away, leaving Ortega alone with his shaking hands and the blade he couldn't bring himself to use. Climbing back to the deck, Blackbeard looked out at his crew, at the frigates tightening their circle, at the sky turning a pale, merciless grey. They still had a choice, and soon they would make it. The decision had been made. There was no turning back. Blackbeard's voice, hoarse but unyielding, rang out over the battered deck of the Queen Anne's Revenge. "Light it!" Isla didn't hesitate. With trembling but determined hands, she touched the flame to the final fuse hidden deep within the broken hull of the San Lorenzo. The spark hissed, disappeared below deck, and for one long, suspended breath, the world waited. Then came the explosion. A deep, bone-shaking roar erupted from beneath the waterline of the Spanish galleon. The force ripped through the hull, sending splinters, cannon debris, and shards of burning timber into the air like deadly confetti. Water surged up through the broken decks, swallowing the lower holds in seconds. The San Lorenzo, proud and mighty just hours before, began to list violently, her bow splitting open like a cracked skull. But Blackbeard's plan wasn't just to destroy her. The blast sent shockwaves across the narrow strait, stirring mud and sand from the seabed, creating a rolling wall of debris, smoke, and flame, a temporary barrier between the Revenge and the Spanish frigates still closing in. Without wasting a breath, Blackbeard turned to Jonas, Elias, and every sailor still standing. "Helm hard to starboard. Bring up whatever sail she'll take. We run now, or we don't run at all." The Queen Anne's Revenge, damaged and bleeding from a dozen wounds, answered like a wounded animal refusing to die. Her battered sails caught what little wind remained. The mainmast groaned under the strain, ropes snapping like broken nerves. The ship turned, sharply, too sharply for any sane captain. But Blackbeard wasn't steering with caution. He was steering with instinct, with memory, with the cold desperation of a man who knew every inch of these cursed waters. Spanish cannon fire roared behind them. Shots fell wide, slamming into the floating wreckage of the San Lorenzo, sending new geysers of water and flame into the air. Smoke blinded the gunners. The strait narrowed with every heartbeat, and still, Blackbeard pushed forward. Navigating through jagged reefs and half-submerged rocks, he guided the Revenge toward a place no chart dared mark, a hidden split in the cliff wall, no wider than 2 ship lengths, concealed by the fog and the natural curve of the land. A path only a madman, or a master of these waters, would dare take. Jonas clung to the rail with one good arm, shouting for the men to hold steady. Isla, barely upright from the last blast, scrambled to secure the remaining sails. Elias kept the forward guns loaded, firing blindly. Toward the Spanish frigates, just to buy seconds. The sea grew shallow, too shallow. Barnacles scraped the hull. The keel kissed stone more than once. Any misstep now, and the Revenge would break apart before reaching open water. But Blackbeard stood firm at the helm. His eyes locked ahead, beyond the smoke, beyond the panic, onto the narrow escape route only he remembered. A crack in the cliffs that had saved him once, years ago, during a night none of his crew knew about. With one last guttural command, he pulled the wheel hard. The Queen Anne's Revenge slipped through the gap, Wood screaming in protest, but holding. Behind them the Spanish frigates slowed, unwilling to follow through waters they didn't know. The smoke thickened, the fire spread, and as the strait disappeared behind a curtain of ruin, Blackbeard's ship vanished with it. The Caribbean swallowed them whole, and for one more day, the legend survived. That night, anchored in a hidden cove far from the straits, where everything had unraveled, the crew of the Queen Anne's Revenge counted their wounded and their dead. The air was thick with salt, smoke, and something heavier, something none of them could name. The small fire burning on the shore gave just enough light for the living to bind their wounds and share what little gold they had managed to pull from the wreck. But the real weight stayed in the silence between them. Elias sat with a bloodied bandage across his brow, staring at nothing. Jonas, his shoulder still stiff and burning, kept watch from the rocks, as if expecting the Spanish frigates to emerge again from the mist at any moment. Isla remained near the powder stores, her hands trembling, not from fear of an enemy, but from knowing how close they had come to lighting their own graves. And Blackbeard sat alone in his cabin. The wood creaked with every shift of the tide. The air was cold, though no one could explain why. With shaking hands, he opened the worn leather cover of his diary, the same book where, over the years, he had scribbled maps, half-formed plans, and confessions too dangerous to speak aloud. That night, he wrote just a few lines. Betrayal doesn't always wear a flag. Sometimes it has tearful eyes and speaks with a brother's voice. Today, we survived. But at sea, every victory costs a piece of your soul. His pen paused, but he didn't cross out a single word. Outside, the wind picked up. It howled low and long, curling around the ship like the sea itself, whispering back every name they had lost. Some men never returned from that day, others stayed, but left pieces of themselves behind in that narrow, cursed strait. And Ortega, his name was never spoken again, not in port, not on deck, not even in the quiet moments before dawn. The sea had taken him, long before the water did. For those who lived, sleep never came easy after that. Some said they still heard echoes from the cliffs on fog-heavy nights, the sound of cannon fire that wasn't there, the faint cries of men long gone, the sharp crack of betrayal breaking through the wind like a memory refusing to fade. And Blackbeard, he carried it all. Every choice, every scar, every shadow that followed them from that morning onward. This was never just a story about gold or warships or even survival. It was about the things the sea keeps and the things it never gives back. Now, I ask you, did you already know this forgotten part of the story? And if you had stood on that deck with the smoke in your lungs and betrayal at your back, what would you have done? What other sea stories, lost, hidden, or buried by time, deserve to be told here? If this story touched you in any way, don't let it vanish like so many other names the sea has taken. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so we can keep bringing to light the stories that were never meant to be forgotten.